Welcome to Coffee and Conflict, a National Security Institute podcast where I sit down with leading authors and experts every fortnight to discuss some of their most recent works and the bigger picture of national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and a senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. This season, we'll be covering topics ranging from the war in Ukraine, 21st century defense strategy, the intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China, and more. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. I'm joined today by Ms. Sherri Goodman, the author of Threat Multiplier, Climate Military Leadership and the Fight for Global Security, out now from Island Press. Her biography and career are deeply impressive, and I'll attempt to do it justice by highlighting some of her most notable positions. Today, she serves as the chair of the board of the Council on Strategic Risks, Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center's Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program. She served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the Center for Naval Analysis, where she was also the founder and executive director of CNA's Military Advisory Board. Sherri was also the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and previously served on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and among many other distinguished posts. Ms. Goodman, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Pleasure to be here with you, Josh.
I'm very excited to host you. I just reviewed your book for the Diplomatic Courier and found it one of the most insightful books, not just on climate security and climate change, but also the bureaucratic knife fighting of politics, which we're going to get to over the course of the conversation. But I really want to start with the title of the book, which is Threat Multiplier, as it brilliantly captures, I think, in a very clear and concise way, what climate change means for national security. Could you describe what that phrase means and how you came about?
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And Threat Multiplier, of course, for you national security geeks listening to this podcast this morning, is a turn of the phrase force multiplier, which we're all familiar with, where technology or another increases our lethality or the military effectiveness of our force. So after a year of study with some of the nation's leading generals and admirals back almost 20 years ago now, we were trying to digest and communicate easily to a national security and broader audience what's the impact of climate change, basically instability in Earth systems, in our natural systems, on the threats we usually account for, such as terrorism, strategic competition, weapons of mass destruction. And we could see that climate change was going to increase all those threats. So we characterize climate change as a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world. And we recognized even then that it would increase instability and tension in stable regions of the world, like our own country. We see that now every day with increased floods, fires, stronger hurricanes disrupting our daily life.
And it's fascinating that you're talking about the inclusion of this as that idea of the threat multiplier for military and national security planning, because historically weather has been so instrumental in military and operational planning. I mean, we're looking at the D-Day invasions was delayed a day because of the weather forecast and how different history might have been if they had gone earlier and encountered bad weather. But what we're talking about here is the instability and destabilization of regions of systemic climate change, not just specific weather variations. Is that right?
Exactly. So, every military operation, every intelligence activity has all historically relied on the weather. You need the weather to plan, as you say, in the D-Day landing, what day you're going to actually send this massive force ashore. And it really mattered to the success of the D-Day operation. Now, in the climate era, we have not just weather, which is reliable out to, for about a week, but we have climate instability so that we can't rely on the historical past to predict what future conditions will be. Floods, storm intensity, fires, drought. And so it's that instability and that unpredictability that we now have to better account for in what we call short-term climate variability, so that we can better understand how to plan and protect and prepare our forces to operate in the future.
I want to take a step back and look at the beginning of your career because this book surveys the arc from your first days with the Senate Armed Services Committee all the way through to your work on climate and security, because it masterfully captures, I think, the arc of change within the Department of Defense and its understanding of not just weather specifically, but the importance of the environment for military planning and also sustainability, and then also coming to climate. But when you first came into Washington into politics, you were working on, if I'm not mistaken, the nuclear weapons enterprise. You write about going from weapons to waste. Could you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. Coming of age in the Cold War, I wanted to work on the greatest national security issues of the day. And, in the 80s and 70s and 80s in the Cold War, those were nuclear weapons, the threat of a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. And so I devoted the early part of my career to working on nuclear weapons and arms control. I wrote my first book on the neutron bomb controversy, where I explored theories of bureaucratic politics and alliance decision making. And so I came to the Senate Armed Services Committee in the mid 1980s, working for Senator Sam Nunn, the powerful chairman of that committee. And I had oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, where we were still at the time producing fissile materials for nuclear weapons. But during my tenure on the committee, all those plants shut down for environment, safety, and health lapses at the end of the Cold War, and when we found we didn't need to produce new plutonium at the time. And so I say my career went from oversight, from weapons to waste, because it went from oversight of the nuclear weapons complex to helping design environment, safety, and health management and cleanup programs for the Department of Energy, and drafting legislation to create the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, sort of mini NRC, overseeing the remaining defense nuclear facilities that just celebrated its 35th anniversary.
Well, congratulations for the anniversary. Sticking with that nuclear weapons enterprise, I want to bring it back to today because there's obviously the discussion of modernization of the nuclear enterprise, the resumption of production of fissile cores and materials. And what you had covered in that beginning portion of your career was a lot of the cleanup for the lapses that came in those facilities. If we're looking at the resumption of production today, what things are you looking for, or would you be looking for if you're back in that position about maintaining environmental stewardship, sustainability, health and safety, if you will, for the nuclear enterprise?
Oh, really excellent question, Josh. I think that the nuclear enterprise today has rigorous safety and environmental management mechanisms and controls that have endured across decades now. What I would be looking for are the climate impacts on nuclear infrastructure that are newer and are more rapidly changing, such as uh, higher water temperatures that at times make our nuclear reactors unable to operate when water temperatures are too high to process, or erosion around nuclear infrastructure because of either sea level rise in coastal areas or drought in inland areas, and intensity of storms. So we have to make our infrastructure, our nuclear infrastructure has to be resilient to a changing climate. So that's what we have to account for. And we also have to assess then what those risks are for our adversaries as well.
Mhm. And I'm loving this conversation because there's so much in this book that I want to cover. So I keep bouncing back and forth, kind of past and the future here. But going back to that period of time about the peace dividend of the Cold War, one of the things that was really struck by in the conversations was how environmental sustainability was a vehicle for cooperation with the post-Soviet Russia. Could you talk about the experiences working with the Russians cleaning up the liquid nuclear waste, and I believe it was off Norway?
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, one of the themes of the first era of environmental security that I tell in the book, and one of the important stories, is how military to military environmental cooperation, which continues to this day in other forms, has been a key component of both our security cooperation and our overall national security um, apparatus in terms of building trust and cooperation with allies and partners. Now, in the early post Cold War period, we were trying to denuclearize Russia, the former Soviet Union, under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program and others. We were removing nuclear fissile materials from the former Soviet states. and Russia itself. And in the early 90s, the Norwegians were highly concerned that sunken and decommissioned Russian submarines in the Kola Peninsula would leak and contaminate their fishing grounds in Norway. And the Norwegian defense minister asked my boss, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense at the time, to engage the Russian military to address these potentially leaking Russian submarines. He came down to my office, which he usually did not do because we always went to the boss's office. But he came down to my office and said, Sherri, I just met with the Norwegian defense minister, and he says the most important thing right now in U.S.-Norwegian defense cooperation is to engage the Russian military on these potentially leaking Russian submarines. And he said, okay, you figure it out. So from there, we created the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program. Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, which was emblematic of that era of engagement with the Russian, Norwegian. We had other militaries involved too. We built with the Russians and Norwegians a cask to safely offload those liquid waste streams from the decommissioned and sunken Russian submarines so that it could be shipped inland for safer storage. We also conducted many military education training and exchanges with the Russian military academies. And, that type of work exchanged through military academies and today happening through our COCOMs, of course, not with Russia, but throughout PACOM and SOUTHCOM, today AFRICOM, and many of our combatant commands, we see these environmental security cooperation exchanges that help to build and strengthen our partnerships in that region, which are so important to our alliance and so critical today as we seek about strengthening our alliance as a bulwark against China in particular.
I want to come back to the international component in a moment, but Secretary Perry, President Clinton, and certainly your time at the Pentagon seemed to be at almost an inflection point for the awareness of environment and climate. We had the post-Cold War peace dividend, you had the election of President Clinton, and certainly Vice President Al Gore. Could you talk about the changes that you were seeing at sort of a macro level on sort of the attitude and awareness of these issues, but then how they manifested themselves within the Department of Defense? Because you write about BRAC, the base realignment and closure process, where you had services fighting over who was responsible for cleaning up. You have the services trying to improve the sustainability, but not want to reduce the operational effectiveness. So at a strategic level, what changes were you seeing? And then how do they manifest within the Department of Defense?
Right. Well, the 90s was a time of elevated attention to environment, safety, health, sustainability, conservation issues, if you will, across the department and across the U.S. in general. Not only, in the Clinton-Gore administration, but really many of this started back in 1992 in the George H.W. Bush administration with his presence at Rio and elevating attention, and it was reflecting a global movement at the time to better attend to sustainability. Global sustainable development was a phrase often used at the time. We were about environmental security, and as you say, Josh, that had really three themes in the 90s in the Department of Defense. First, it was about cleaning up contaminants from the past, and that was a lot at our military bases, active and closing bases. We were closing a lot of military bases at the end of the Cold War under the Base Realignment and Closure Act, and so the President Clinton wanted to fast track that cleanup, and we had to find ways to engage with communities and partner instead of what had been the norm before, which was somewhat of resistance to pressure from external pressures about cleanup and the extent of it. So we really reset the table, if you will, to say, okay, we're going to figure out how to do this working with communities and for the benefit of the people and our military families on base, and we're going to work with our regulators to try to move things along in a smarter way, streamline the reviews. And we did all that, including by, even enabling EPA to have the kind of staff it needed to work at the pace that the Department of Defense, the President wanted the Department of Defense to work at the time. The second dimension of this was not just cleaning up the past, but conserving natural resources on military bases, because military bases are islands of nature, and many endangered species and fragile ecosystems are found on the 25 million acres of land that the Department of Defense manages on behalf of the American people. And so protecting the bald eagle or the desert tortoise or the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker, which actually just came off the endangered species list not long ago, partly as a result of the good stewardship efforts of the military over many decades now, to actually take the tree in which that bird lives in places like Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, and Camp Lejeune and Eglin Air Force Base, and convert the tree into a realistic training obstacle instead of cutting it down. And therefore, you could preserve and protect, even enhance military training and readiness, while at the same time protecting the natural resource. And I think soldiers and Marines feel very proud of that work, as do their leaders at the from that era on forward. So that's one. That's a second theme: preserving the natural resources while maintaining robust military training and readiness. And the third theme, as we've just talked about, has been this military to military environmental and in the future now climate security cooperation, which enables us to enhance and make more robust our engagements with our allies and partners.
I absolutely love that story of using the trees as a realistic training obstacle because indicative of the creative solutions that I think you write about in this book and the incremental process of changing the apparatus that is the Pentagon. We often hear about the institution of the Department of Defense and how slow it is and how much it's like moving a big battleship. And a lot of the stories that you have in here are very small wins in individual contexts, but in aggregate added up to rather significant changes. Could you talk about the process of sort of getting buy-in within the Pentagon? Because early on in your career, you write about how you just had, for lack of a better phrase, stick in the mud officers who are only focused on the war fighting. And if you are going to be protecting that tree, it's going to prevent successful training operations. Through to the tail end of the book, which we'll come to a little bit, where you have these Department of Defense and military officers on the ground working on ecology projects. I mean, that is a sea change in attitudes within the Pentagon itself, but also the services.
Right. Well, it is a combination of a changing sort of national and global environmental ethos and ethic at the time, reflected both through the leadership of the military. You think of the Army Chief of Staff at the time, General Gordon Sullivan, who reset the Army after the Cold War, but also Red Rachel Carson, and also was committed to protecting the bald eagle in Kansas, and also figured out this way to protect the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker and preserve military training. He later became the first chair of the CNA Military Advisory Board, and it was leaders like that and many others, combined with being persistent. As you say, I had the privilege of serving for 8 years as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And so oftentimes we talk about, career civilians want to wait you out, the political appointees out, but I was there quite a long time. And the military also rotate, every couple of years. And, as we know in big bureaucracies, change does occur incrementally. You spend many years where you think you're hitting your head against a brick wall, and you lose some battles, but you got to keep strategically focused on what the wider lens is. I'll give you an example. When I first came into the Pentagon, I noticed that we didn't have a lot of recycling bins around the Pentagon itself, the largest office building in the world, and therefore people were not recycling. And I went to the mayor of the Pentagon at the time and I said, Doc, we need some more recycling containers here. And he was like, okay, yeah, fine. And then I'd go back to my office and nothing would happen. And I couldn't figure it out. Like, why was nothing happening? And finally, I decided that I needed to engage the senior leadership. So I asked my boss, Secretary Perry, would he do a recycling event with me for Earth Day? And when the secretary, of defense decides to have an event that enabled those recycling containers to be present around the pit. Now, that's a small thing, but it showcases kind of where the institution is going and where people want the leadership to happen. And it's a number of these incremental steps that then you look back and you see. Also, we put in place measures and metrics. And it sounds boring, but everyone who's listening to this know you can't manage what you don't measure. And in the early days in the 90s, we really weren't managing environment. We weren't managing how we were cleaning up or notices of violation and compliance or conservation of natural resources. So it was the military that came to me, the civil engineers, and they said, Sherri, we can't make this a robust program unless we've got some metrics. So let's go through the process of agreeing what are DOD's environmental and sustainability metrics. And then we can actually reward those who do well. And as we all know, the services like to compete against each other. So then they would compete, for particular environmental awards. And even within the services, within different commands, they would compete, so they'd be measured by, at each Air Force Materiel Command, they'd be measured every quarter by their 4-star, which bases were doing better or worse against what metric. And that really mattered because when when the boss pays attention to it, then everyone else falls in line. So I think that's how you enable it. Just like in any large organization, you have to show that it's a priority. You have to have a strategy, a roadmap, and then you have to have resources. And that's, of course, always the hardest challenge in government, is to make sure that you've got adequate resources against your priorities, because as we say, a strategy without resources is hallucination. So you have to be able to have a vision, have a strategy, but then work, the budget angle as well.
I think this book again is I think so complex and not going just into the climate change aspect, but that bureaucratic politics that you just spoke about. And I think this should, for anybody who is interested in how to get the government business of government done, I think should really just look at this book and read it, because it's fascinating. These little anecdotes of how you get buy-in from senior leadership, how you work with the budget, how you get the Earth Day, leveraging the services competitiveness. The Marines don't want to lose to anybody, but so they're going to try to beat everybody, and just playing the game like that to get change done. And it's individuals like yourself and career civil servants who have affected so much significant change.
Exact. So many unsung heroes in the book. And partly what I try to do is lift their voices, because
Mhm.
people don't know about all these little, all the work that is occurring every day that amounts to progress and benefit on behalf of the American people.
Mhm.
And also with saving money, because when you reduce waste, you're saving money.
Absolutely. And it's a bit of an anecdote to a lot of the criticisms, I think, of the inverted commas deep state or the blob that's out there, just these nameless and faceless civil servants who are just doing things for whatever purposes and spending tax dollars. No, there's actually a lot of amazing work that's being done for the national security enterprise specifically, but the business of government writ large. Uh, Looking at your career, so you spent 8 years as the Deputy Undersecretary and then shifted over to the civilian sector and started up the Military Advisory Board at CNA. Could you talk about that and what the thinking behind it was?
Right. So it started when a group of foundations approached me and asked if I would convene a group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change, something I'd been deeply interested in since my time in the Department of Defense, where we had our first encounter with climate change in the late 1990s in the Kyoto Climate Conference, which was COP3. Now we're in COP29. And we didn't really get to the security implications of climate change. We got to more the energy, what would be the impact of changing
Mhm.
our, of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and changing our energy systems. And so there was this piece that was unaddressed um, from that era. And I knew there would be implications, but we needed to do that rigorous assessment, and we needed the voice of military leaders. And at the same time, in the US, but almost 20 years ago now, the conversation was already becoming polarized on climate change, where it was seen as only an environmental issue.
Mhm.
And I knew it was more than that, but it needed the rigorous assessment that we could do at a place like CNA, and it needed the voice of the military and the wisdom of the warfighters. And so I gathered General Gordon Sullivan, the former head of the Nuclear Navy, Skip Bowman, former head of PACOM, Admiral Prior, and many others. And we went on a climate journey with the nation's leading climate scientists, as well as national security and intelligence professionals, both in the US and in the UK. And after a year of study, where the warfighters each did their own particular assessment on different regions for which they had where they had served, so they were bringing their own experience to bear in PACOM, Southcom, CENTCOM, and etc. We could tell that the evidence was sufficiently clear. And as General Sullivan said, this is basically a risk management issue. We could,
Mhm.
and in military planning, we assess all risks, right? We assess the nuclear risk, chem, bio, today cyber, aggression, and then we decide how much risk we're going to take as a nation, and how we should position our forces to either prevent and deter that risk or to assume some level of risk. And as General Sullivan said, we don't wait for 100% certainty, because if we do, we know something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. And so there was sufficient evidence that we needed to act, and that this was going to be a serious national security issue. As in the Cold War, we assessed the nuclear threat as a high consequence, but low probability, but high consequence threat, and which was worth investing billions of Americans' GDP to defend and deter. And fortunately, we've so far mostly won that battle with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Now, climate risk is arguably a high probability and high consequence set of risks. So the question is, how do we invest to become resilient to it, and also to reduce that risk through mitigating the threat?
What's fascinating, especially in the second half of the book, is you basically do a tour de horizon of the individual theaters and the manifestation of climate risks and climate instability. Everything from in Afghanistan, just the requirements of trucking the water to forward operating bases, all the way through to the thawing Arctic and the northern sea routes, and the exploration of resources on the seabed there. I'm curious, when you look at it, were there any surprising anecdotes or stories in the research process that you perhaps didn't expect that manifested themselves?
Well, I think at the time we didn't appreciate the extent of
Mhm.
strategic instability occurring from prolonged climate threats around the world. We could see that climate was going to be disruptive, that, an immediate event like a more terrifying typhoon would demand more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief by American forces. I think what's become more evident in the last decade or so is how these prolonged threats, such as drought across much of North Africa in the Middle East, has become really a petri dish for terrorism. So you already have a place that suffers from regional instability across much of the area, for a lot of weak governance and authoritarian rule, but you have societies that have been highly dependent on ample water sources to create food, grow crops, um, farming and herding, and now many places are drying out or becoming unstable, and then people move to urban areas, and they migrate, and there's conflict and civil unrest, and that leads to just this prolonged instability where various Al Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban in Afghanistan, others can take advantage and basically maintain control. And it's very hard for outside forces, as we've witnessed in the last almost 2 decades now, to reduce the sources of insecurity just by our own military presence. We're unable to do it, so we're not doing it. But that doesn't stop the problem of the prolonged food and water insecurity that has threatened so many.
So when you look at that, the increasing drought, the desertification of North Africa, and the resulting migration movements and whatnot, how do you see that awareness translating into actual military strategic planning? Because some of what you're describing, obviously, the military is going to be responsible for responding to terrorism, for example, insurgency, low intensity warfare. But a lot of the components that would be, in theory, responsible for responding to are not necessarily within the military's purview. USAID, Department of State, I'm thinking of these other organizations and apparatuses of government to have a true, the dime idea approach to national security.
Right, exactly. I mean, the military itself is never going to solve the climate problem, right? The military can be a partner with other agencies in developing solutions and sustainable solutions, but its role is always naturally going to be limited. It can be it's an important security partner, but then you have to have ample development, diplomatic, and economic opportunities for the communities to become resilient and to become sustainable. And so increasingly challenging.
And when you look as well, I'm looking at the climate change in the context of strategic competition. Obviously, the United States is orienting itself increasingly towards the Indo-Pacific, particularly militarily, economically, diplomatically. China being one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide and climate change emissions. There's this tension where you have some who want to engage with China and see the need to do so, but then there's also the security and defense aspect of the relationship competition with China. How do you see balancing those two, where one is very much a security challenge, which the environment is a threat, or the climate change is a threat multiplier too, but also engaging with China is necessary to address the long-term systemic challenges of climate change?
Right. Okay. And I want to just go back for a minute on the last point we were discussing, Josh, and say that there is also in terms of how we deal with the prolonged threats, particularly of drought and instability and water. There is a new U.S. framework on climate resilience and security that, very importantly, I think recognizes for the first time that you need a combination of, to have security in this current era, you need state stability, but you also need community resilience. So it traditionally, national security has focused on what's happening between states or non-state actors, but it's all about what's happening at the state level. But now in this era, we know that community resilience is a sort of an essential component of that state stability. So I wanted to add that important point. Now, as to the Indo-Pacific and China, and opportunities for cooperation, but also the existential competition in which we find ourselves with China today. Yes, China and the U.S., along with India and others, are the major emitters of greenhouse gases, and so having some agreement in the context of global climate goals and targets is important for all nations. But then how you get there becomes a sense of a competition. Okay, and I think we are locked in a competition now with China on a race to the clean energy future and also decarbonization. And already we see that China, has a beat on us in solar, for example. And so I think, to me, the question is, where is the U.S. going to be, not only in exporting oil and gas, but also in the advanced clean energy technology of the future, new nuclear, for example. Historically, we were American leadership in nuclear and civilian nuclear energy provided a great deal of baseload power, not only in our own country but around the world. We've got a whole new generation of small modular and micro reactors. Are we going to be the ones providing that safer technology to countries? There's been a commitment at the recent climate conference last year, and again re-upped by more countries in the conference going on right now, to triple nuclear energy by 2050. And so the U.S. has got to be in that game. Same with things like advanced batteries, the next generation of battery technology. So we need to look at every segment of the clean energy market and ensure that we are going to be globally competitive in that race to the future.
The aspect that you mentioned on the sort of Sahel in North Africa about the community resilience reminds me of the portion of the book where we talk about the improving American domestic resilience, particularly of the national security infrastructure. We saw the significant hurricane rolling through the Gulf Coast and the impact on the Air Force bases down there. I was recently down at Cape Canaveral with the SLD-45 and the space launch components, and they were talking quite a bit about the risks to the pads for sea level rise. And so I'm curious, looking at the domestic infrastructure, how much of there's a growing recognition of the changes that are necessary and how much are actually underway to, as you said at the beginning as well, with the nuclear enterprise resilience as well.
Right. Well, a great example is what happened to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. Um, in 2018, Hurricane Michael ripped the roofs off the hangars of the F-35, and it was heavily damaged in that storm. And now it's being rebuilt as the Air Force's climate resilient base of the future. And so, in the more recent hurricanes, Milton and Helene, it fared a little bit better. The areas parts of the base that are already been rebuilt to withstand higher winds and stronger storm intensity. So yes, it's going to be important for military readiness that our bases, coastal bases in particular, but all our bases can withstand a growing range of climate impacts, whether it's fires, floods, permafrost thaw and collapse in the Arctic is also a real concern.
If we take a step back and look at everything in aggregate, the change that you effected in the Department of Defense with CNA and also looking to the future, if you were to grade the Department of Defense today, how are they doing in terms of the preparations for and adaptations to climate change? And then if we forecast out as sort of the second part of the question over the next 4 years of President Trump and his administration, what needs to continue to be done under to prepare better for the impacts of climate change for the Department of Defense writ large?
Hmm. Well, great question, Josh. I think the department um, on its strategy and plans on climate resilience and adaptation has has done quite well. Probably an A minus on the strategy and planning. Now, it's a long-term challenge. It doesn't happen overnight. As we say, we have to have the resources and sustainable level of investment to make resilient the base infrastructure, and also to ensure climate literacy across the force. So a lot of that has begun. But to enable it to be sustained, and we have things like war games now that include climate scenarios so that we can understand what kind of strategic stability and disruption will affect our forces when they deploy in the Pacific, in Africa, in Southcom, in the Western Hemisphere, and elsewhere. And so I think continuing on that path, and then also moving towards net zero in our military bases so that we can both decarbonize but also become more effective as we do, because it's also about energy resilience. So what I would say with the incoming administration, it's about mission assurance and energy resilience. And most of our bases today have a requirement to operate for 2 weeks without power from the grid and be able to do black start exercises. And one of the main ways that's being accomplishing that today is by putting microgrids on military bases, which gives you the flexibility to hook on various types of energy sources. Yes, of course, it could be your diesel generator, but at the first net zero military base in the U.S., Albany Marine Corps Logistics Base in Georgia, they also have a waste to energy plant where they're extracting methane from the local landfill. And they have other forms of energy with the exchanges with the community. So also being able to provide power into the community in the case of severe weather events. So I think these are the kinds of efforts that are important to sustain. And I know, it's been a bipartisan effort, in Congress over almost the last decade to ensure that our military bases and our troops are resilient, because today troops have to operate in hotter temperatures, for example. Training in the South and Southwest at our military bases. We have more Black Flag days now than ever before, and the projections on that is that's going to increase as temperatures rise, and that puts troops increasingly at risk of heat stroke and heat stress. And so we need to revamp our training regimens, our equipment, and understand how to protect our soldiers so that they continue the mission, both training in the U.S. and for deployments overseas.
I want to ask one final question. If you were to be asked into the Office of the Secretary of Defense in January 2025, so next year, and they said, what is the one piece of advice that you can give me as the incoming Secretary of Defense for preparing for climate change and preparing the services for climate change? What would that piece of advice be?
You know, for our military, climate is not a red or a blue issue, it's a risk issue. And we know those risks are mounting. So we need to make our force resilient and protect our troops against that risk.
I think it's fantastic. I love that. Neither red nor blue. So on that note, I think this is going to bring our latest episode to a close. I want to thank Ms. Goodman for joining us today. Thanks as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage as well. And make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Ms. Goodman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Josh. Thank you to your team as well.